talk about second conjugation verbs. So we talked about verbs. We've talked about how verbs belong to conjugations. Conjugations are basically like noun declensions, but for verbs. So just like nouns with the same declension follow the same ending sets, verbs of the same conjugations have the same principal parts. The general endings like o or m, s and t, mus, tis, enti, those stay the same, but the principal parts, remember, are the stems of the verbs, and so the stem that you're adding those endings onto change a little bit with each verb conjugation. Most of the verb rules that I'm going to give you on how to form the different conjugations or how to form the different tenses are going to be made so that they work for all conjugations, but there are some rules that are different and some tenses that work differently for different conjugations, so we'll talk about those when they come up. Second conjugation is a fairly regular verb conjugation, so let's take a look at that. So you might remember the other day I told you, so verb conjugations are groups of verbs with similar principal parts, similar to how noun declensions work. First conjugation is what you've already seen. Those verbs end in an O in the first principal part and then go ari, awi, atus. You might also remember that I told you that are, that second principal part, that's the part that tells you what conjugation you're dealing with. And this will be the first time we start distinguishing this. So second principal parts tell which conjugation a verb belongs to. For the first conjugation, that's are. For the second conjugation, that's long, ere. You might also recall that I've told you there's a few long marks I'm going to make you learn throughout the year. You've learned the first one, which is the long A in ablative singular for first declension nouns. This is your second long mark you have to learn. It's the long mark that marks second conjugation. That's because when we learn third conjugation on our next lesson, that's a short ere. So I want you to be able to distinguish between them so you know what conjugation verb you're dealing with. So conjugation long ere is the second principal part of a second conjugation verb. So second conjugation verbs, the first principal part always ends in EO. This is kind of unique. Second conjugation verbs are the only ones that you can identify using just their first principal part. For all other verb conjugations, you can only tell by the second principal part. But so it's EO, long ere, ui, itus. The reason this E is long is actually because it's a short ere, just like in third, but it squishes in with this E from the first principal part to make one long E. So that's where that long mark comes from. That's why it's present there. So our verb that we're using as our example for our second conjugation verbs is habeo. So habeo, habere, habui, habitus. So again, you see that EO, it's a short E here, but it gets squished with that E and the ERE ending to make one long E instead of being habiere, right? Instead of having two E's there, they sort of combine to make one long E, and that's why we have that long mark. You see the wedding ring picture that I've picked for here. For two things, habeo is to have and to hold, right? So wedding vows. So that's a nice little visual cue for you about what habeo means and that it's a second conjugation. Conjugation is similar to the word to conjoin with, and so also giving that idea there as we talk about conjugations. So the rule for PAI verbs, as you all know, is go to the second principal part, drop the RE, add the endings, which are O or M, S and T, mus, tis, enti. And you also know that the first person singular form in PIA is just the first principal part. So if we're conjugating, putting through the forms, habeo, we start with the first person singular, habeo. Then for the rest, we go to the second principal part, habere, drop that RE and get habe, and add our endings. Habes, habet, habemus, habetus, habent. I have, you have, he, she, it has, we have, y'all have, they have. And there you have it. That is second conjugation verbs. So the big change that's going to happen with this is not going to really show up in your translating or in your grammar. It's going to show up in your vocab. So from here on out, you are now responsible for knowing the endings, the principal parts, for second conjugation verbs. So now you have two kinds of verbs that I'm going to mark right or wrong. If you have a first conjugation verb, I better see that ari, awi, atus. If you have a second conjugation verb, I better see that airy, ooey, it, juice endings. Or if it's irregular, whatever that irregular form is. But if it has a long ERE in the second principal part, you're now responsible for memorizing that vocabulary form. So if you haven't been learning those vocabulary forms, you need to make sure you go back and memorize those. Go back through your list, look for any with a long ERE or an EO in the first principal part, and make sure you memorize them. That's it. Short and sweet second conjugation verb lesson for you guys there.